Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second KICS community lecture this school year. We're really happy that we're able to hold these events again after 2 years hiatus, so yeah, really you're all very welcome. We're absolutely delighted to be welcoming back a very distinguished visitor who last visited KICS in 2015 and gave a very thought-provoking talk on the subject of Islam in the 21st century, which explored the interdependence of modernity and tradition. Professor Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim is the Charles Howard Chandler Professor of Law at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and the author of several books, including Islam and the Secular State and Islam and Human Rights Beyond the Zero-Sum Game. Tonight, Professor Naim will be telling us more about the ideas presented in his most recent book, Decolonizing Human Rights, which emphasizes the decisive role of human agency in social change. I'm sure we're all in for a thoroughly fascinating talk this evening, and we will have time for some questions at the end from the audience. One last thing before I go, please can everybody ensure that their phone is on silent. And without further ado, I am extremely honored to now invite Professor Naim to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Okay, it works. The question is, do I work? It is really a privilege and an honor to be back to the same audience twice. At least I was not that offensive the first time, so I get invited again. I credit my friend Fathi for the renewed invitation. But I caution also that I'm a heretic. And I tend to be heretical whenever I can and get away with it, that is. And you'll see that what I'm going to be heretical about is in fact more of an orthodoxy than we think. One of my favorite lines is to say that every orthodoxy is started as a heresy. Not every heresy becomes an orthodoxy, but there is no orthodoxy ever that was not a heresy when it started. So maybe this is a new, either persistent heresy or an eventual orthodoxy. The point is that I will be challenging some of our basic assumptions about human rights and about their practice, about their protection, but I believe I do so in the interest of human rights in the true sense of the term. So I will go, I think I'm trying to do this well enough to be able to communicate effectively. I thought to have something in writing. I am not used to PowerPoints usually, but maybe because I'm using several different terms and concepts, I better do this. Okay. I speak of colonization as domination and exploitation, broadly defined. And when we do so, we'll find that actually it is a vastly common and ancient phenomenon. That throughout human history there have been sort of experiences, and also when we think of the scale, we realize that if we really seek to reverse domination and exploitation, we'll have a lot to do in terms of every level of our lives, from our families to our communities. So in being critical of colonization and invoking notions of decolonization, I'm not in the least assuming that this is a foreign or necessarily European or some other type of limited phenomenon. It's a very common phenomenon. We experience it as we live our lives. And often the example I gave about women is that the ease and the normality by which we invoke hierarchy among boys and girls in our families tends to reflect actually a fundamental failure to recognize and to acknowledge the human equality of women. And unless we confront that sort of level, we are not really going to go far. And as I also in this, unfortunately my slides are a bit crowded, but I think I will have at least a chance to go one by one. Colonizing is often rationalized in the name of religion, progress, enlightenment, or other alleged interests of the subject. That it's often, ironically, it is the victim's interest that is invoked to justify their domination and exploitation. And simply, if you go by that, then decolonization is reversing that process. But through the protection of human rights, I see it because, and you'll see that my definition of human rights is truly universal and truly fundamental. It's really about, I see human rights as both the ends and means of liberation, all liberations at every level of social, interpersonal, as well as community and otherwise. And the process, as also I will try to briefly illustrate, is also contingent and contested. Human rights is such an attractive term now these days in our lives that everybody claims it, and nobody will disown it or pretend that they don't subscribe to it. And of course, in the most atrocious experiences and practices are done in the name of protection of human rights, or in the name of, or justified ultimately as a means to get to the end of human rights ultimately. But for me, simply, it has to be the means and the ends at once. So if we do not uphold these principles in actual, the process by which we recognize, we define, and we implement, then the outcome is not a human rights outcome. And also that the point also I will be trying to make is that it has the human agency of the subject, that if we are truly speaking of the concept of universality of human rights, as I will try to explain briefly, then we are talking about a way by which human rights are acknowledged, respected, and protected by the subjects themselves before they can be by anybody else. And therefore, often when I criticize major organizations, international so-called human rights organizations, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, I always say that I used to be director of Africa Watch for a couple of years in the 1990s. And I resigned because I couldn't live with the idea of the perpetuating of dependency that such organizations are given to do or to be. So I say that we fail if we do not make ourselves redundant. That is the very idea that we have to stay. I thought I did this. Khalas, give a second. You know, it helps to have a phone that says azan while you're talking. It depends on the audience, of course. But sometimes it helps. You know, like give us a little bit credibility. I have a niece who is with us actually tonight, who used to live in London for a few months. She was caught up in the pandemic, and she was explaining that she had her phone, and just for fun, she thought, why not set adhan on the phone? But then she was in the underground, and then as the adhan went, she grabbed it and tried to silence it as fast as she can, because she thought, you know, she doesn't want to make her co-travelers nervous with the adhan blaring in the metro or the underground. So what I'm trying to get to here is that, let me give a few working definitions. I think I can do this. Okay. Up. I don't know why it's not doing this. Okay. it will come one by one. So it is basically, it is, human rights are the entitlement of every human being by virtue of their humanity. I don't have to be anything or anybody else than being human. And when you think of that, you'll understand that it's really a fundamentally challenging proposition. That it is for the first time in human history that we speak in these terms. The idea, of course, of human value, human this and human that has always been around, with philosophers, with dreamers, with poets maybe, but not in a real practical policy and practice sense of the term. And when as I say, it is the entitlement of every human being by virtue of their humanity. All I need to do is to be human. And so long as I remain human, I remain entitled to these rights. And this leads immediately to a distinction between what I call between human rights and civil rights. Actually, in our practice, in our experience, when we speak of human rights, we tend to think of human rights as civil rights, in fact, meaning that the norms of equality, non-discrimination, protection against torture, all of these are civil rights in the sense that they are rights which are granted by some states, not all of them, and as fundamental rights within that society. But human rights are much more than that. Because they are the rights of the human by virtue of their humanity, not by virtue of the jurisdiction of the state which acknowledges their rights. When you speak of civil rights, actually the state has a fundamental role. It is the agency or the entity that acknowledges the rights. It is the entity that is addressed by the rights, and it is the entity that's supposed to protect those rights. And there is a paradox in that. What I call self-regulation by the state. How can we expect the state to protect us against itself? But this is, unfortunately, of course, it used to be the model with fundamental rights, constitutional rights, sometimes they're called, and that's fine. And each community or society will try to struggle to have their state protect those rights more and in a more systematic way and so on. But what we are talking about universality of human rights is much more that regardless of what the state does or fails to do. So as soon as you rely on the state to protect the right, it is not a human right that you are talking about. Because it is a right that the state chooses to acknowledge, not the right that I'm entitled to by virtue of my humanity. And I'll come to highlight some of the ironies of this point a little bit to come. So it is that notion of regardless of what the state does or fails to do. This is crucial. And this is the most fundamental challenge that the human rights discourse presents to the modern nation state, so-called, or territorial state, I prefer to call it, because none of them is really truly a nation. And in any case, the notion of nation itself is problematic. So I say that I prefer to call them territorial states, meaning that they are the states which have jurisdiction over a definite and specific territory. Within that territory, the state is sovereign. You cannot make the state do within its territory and to its own population what it's not willing to do, or refrain from doing what it wishes to do. And here goes another sort of contradiction with the idea of human rights. Because if we rely on the state to protect the rights, and as I explained, actually the current system that we think is the international human rights system and the regional systems like the European or the African so-called or the inter-American, they are in fact contradiction in terms. And let me just get into this point briefly like this. Here to say that the fact that human rights are the way that it has happened in the modern era, that is in the post-Second World War era, by states coming together to negotiate the terms of so-called human rights treaties. like the punishment and prevention of the crime of genocide, one of the earliest in the modern era, which claim to be universal because they speak about the rights of every human to be protected against this. And then we get the Universal Declaration itself, which claims to be universal, of universal rights. But the way that the choice of, for one thing to begin with, the very idea that we call it right is what I call liberal relativism. Because the idea of rights is not universal. But so we need to think of a way of addressing the need to protect and to respect human rights without limiting them to the notion of right. And why it is liberal relativism is that it requires justiciability. You know, since I started studying human rights in the 1960s, I think, at least late 60s, Al Suleiman is here, so he can correct me if I'm wrong. He's an old colleague and friend. That we took it as given that unless I can enforce a state through state sort of institutions like courts, then it is not a right. It could be a moral claim, it could be this and that, but it is not a right. But the problem is that the notion of rights in that sense is not only relative to liberal ideologies and liberal cultures, but that it is practically untenable in most parts of the world. The process of legal enforcement of rights is very difficult to sustain in this country at least, and many other countries that one can think of, simply because they don't have the institutions, they don't have the infrastructure to make it so. So we have to think of what I call human rights as entitlements rather than rights. Rights are entitlements, but the term entitlement, I mean it as a broader sense of a claim that everybody can assert and can defend. And again, here I give the example of refugees as really the ultimate example of the fundamental failure of every single human society on this planet. Nowhere are refugees' rights acknowledged as human rights, though refugees are really the ultimate human subject of human rights, because they lack the protection of any state. And therefore, if we do not provide for concepts and institutions that will protect their rights by just their virtue of being human beings, then we are failing in our claim subscribed to the culture of human rights. And the idea, of course, goes to the history of the protection of refugees, so-called 1951 convention, and the 1977, I think, convention also that acknowledge. The problem is with the rights of refugees is that it is the state which decides who is and who is not a refugee. And of course, when you think of it in a world of nation states or territorial states, you can't have it otherwise, because you can't force a state to take in people who, by just claiming to be refugees, are acknowledged as refugees. So the 1951 structure, which was primarily intended for post-Second World War Europe, it was not intended to begin with as a global document and institution. And it was just extended to other parts of the world for the lack of the political will to sit down and really talk through what it means to protect the rights of refugees. But in every state, it is the state which decides who is and who is not a refugee, who is qualified to enter. And by virtue of that act itself, immediately we are no longer talking about human rights. We are talking about a form of civil rights, that is rights which the state acknowledges and is declares its willingness to protect, which actually it may not do so in practice. I live in the United States. Now I think I'm an American citizen, therefore I'm really grateful for the possibilities and privileges of that standing. But I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I live in and a place where within 2 years, 2 hours drive from where I'm sitting, people have been sitting for months waiting for the US state or US federal authorities to determine whether or not they are refugees. So you sit in imprisonment, in confinement, denied your fundamental right to freedom of movement, freedom of association, every other freedom that Americans take for granted, but you are locked up until the state decides whether or not you qualify to be admitted into the states. And there are many who are not admitted, of course. I would expect most of them are not, and they are deported. So it is really in the system itself there is. I spend so much time on this so that to make the point that when we speak about human rights, we should really speak very cautiously about our own, the limitations of our own thinking about the idea. Okay, so let me see if I can move on. Okay. What I call the 3 C's of human rights. I'm trying to unpack a little bit, some of have said already, and hopefully we'll come to revisit this in discussion. By the 3 C's, I mean the concept, the content, let me do this, the content and the context. Those are the 3 C's. So why C's or why 3 C's? So the concept is universality. If we are not talking about universality, then we are not talking about human rights, which is fine. I mean, most of our history, human beings on this planet for 10, 15, 20,000 years, I'm sure longer, who really never conceived of rights which are universal to every human being by virtue of their humanity. Now we, in this modern, post-colonial, post-Second World War age, we claim to be talking about universal rights, the rights of every human being by virtue of their humanity. Because when you read the Universal Declaration, every person, everybody, everyone, so it is always every. It's not qualified by anything else, except the mechanism by which that acknowledgement is defined and enacted, quote unquote. Because all the language is a language of state sort of institutions getting together to negotiate the rights and declarations like the Universal Declaration, Rights of the Child. There is a tendency that has been to have a declaration and then have a convention. But in some instances it does not work like that. But like freedom of religion, it was a declaration, I think in 1981, it has never acquired the status of being a convention or a covenant. But the convention is problematic because it's a treaty between states. It's binding only on states. You have to be a state to be part of the negotiations of treaties, and you have to be a state to be able to sign and then hopefully ratify and then incorporate that treaty in your domestic law system. Through all of that, it is the state which decides. It is the state which decides to join the negotiation of a treaty, or once adopted to ratify that treaty, and once ratified to incorporate that treaty in its own national jurisdiction. And throughout, the process is a process of diminishing the scope and the scale of the right that is being acknowledged and protected. Because, and you will see that in that the term about ratification is a subject of treaties, that is subject to major exceptions. One of them is so-called reservations, that every state has a right to make a reservation about any element of the treaty in question, so that they can choose, as the United States does, starting with the United States, for some reason, unusually sort of ratified the Torture Convention. But then they entered the reservation saying that the definition of torture is only that which is acknowledged by Congress and enacted into US law. So what's the point of having an international treaty obligation if you are only limiting your obligation to what your own domestic law says it is. The United States, for example, enters a reservation about the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So the treaty, the Torture Convention, speaks about that any dispute between the parties as to the right in question is to be determined by the International Court of Justice. The United States exempts itself from that. So this is what I mean about how the state controls the question of how rights are protected or respected, how they are defined to begin with, and so on. When it comes to the content, I'm a Muslim, I hope, and I think that the question of, that's where I started, back in the 70s, the question of incompatibility of Sharia with the very idea of human rights. It is not just simply the fact that there are certain elements of what so-called Sharia that are inconsistent with the current normative content of human rights, but the very idea of equal humanity is not acknowledged by Sharia. Sharia, which is I take it, just to be clear, Sharia is not Islam itself. It is the understanding of Islam by Muslims. And whatever understanding is, it is a contextual understanding, it is a historical understanding. It is not an absolute understanding. So I say that in order to open the door for the possibility of what I will end up with, of what I call cultural transformation. That we can understand Sharia differently. But so far we have not even acknowledged, as Muslims, in this country especially, I think many of us have lived through the hell of the last 30, 40 years of the life in this country, to acknowledge even that we have a problem with Sharia. And remember I said that I'm a heretic? So when I speak of this, people are saying, how can you say that? How can you say that Sharia is incompatible with human rights? Sharia has always, no, Sharia has not always protected human rights because it has a fundamental distinction between men and women, between Muslims and non-Muslims. In fact, there are human beings who are so-called non-believers, who do not subscribe to any of the so-called divinely ordained religions, Christianity, Judaism, and some of the Hinduism. Without that, you are not even a person. So you are not a person. You don't have any status in the legal order of things, or even the moral order of things. So for Sudanese who are so-called animists or polytheists, they don't have a standing even to stay or to live within a so-called Islamic state. Fortunately, this country has never managed to be, and no other country has. But I think that if you go to the doctrine itself, it says that you have to be a believer in one of the divinely. So you have to be a believer in a religion as defined by Sharia itself. And any religion, Buddhism, for example, is not acknowledged by Sharia as a religion. Therefore, you cannot qualify as the inferior status of being a dhimmi, being someone who has a charter of protection and with the state, because you do not qualify, because you are not subscribing to so-called divinely ordained religion. So my point, therefore, is that we have to acknowledge the fundamental challenge of Sharia, but also I speak about what I call liberal relativism, which I have already touched on. And the reason I use the term is to challenge being a Sudanese, being a Muslim, being someone who came from post-colonial context when I first came out to study human rights and elsewhere, and to move in the corridors of human rights power. Whenever I speak about, I started something very early in the 1980s, what I call cultural legitimacy of human rights. And my proposition was simple, that not challenging the very idea of human rights as defined by the international documents, but to saying that whatever it is, it has to be culturally legitimate in my culture for me to be expected to observe it diligently and honestly. But that was charged as cultural relativism. And yes, I would say it is, but so is everybody else. There is no universal human being. Every human being is relative to something, whether religion, culture, gender, race, ethnicity. So it is the idea of a universal human being floating sort of in mid-air without any attachment of, that qualifies their worldview, their attitudes, and their behavior. I'm not aware, and let us see if you have ideas about that when we come to the discussion. So in other words, therefore, Sharia and also African culture, I might say, which I often invoke, is in fact incompatible with universality because it is relative to a culture, relative to a religious tradition. So is relative liberalism. Liberals are fundamentally, in fact, imperially relativist because they conquer the world to impose their relativist views as universal. And of course, they don't become universal by virtue of imposition in that imperial way. Therefore, I'm going to lead my analysis, hopefully, to speak about what I call ethical behavioral conformity. That is, I see that the last point, number 3, the context, limitations of legal enforcement versus the possibilities of ethical behavioral conformity. And the point is that legal enforcement is inherently limited. It is piecemeal, it is reactive, it is only after the fact. It is extremely expensive, difficult to maintain on large scale, and you have to contest case by case and litigate case by case. And when you do that, you'll spend a lifetime trying to cover just a fraction of what human rights violations are taking on in any place that you can think of. Even in so-called highly developed societies or countries, you don't have that magnitude of resources. I mean, when it takes 10, 15 years to litigate a case, how can you cover the massive level, unless you define the rights themselves in a way that is very limited, as I said, in the liberal relativist sense of being rights that are justiciable, that you can only protect by going to court. If you can't go to court to protect the rights, it's not a right. So instead of that, I fundamentally shift to what I call ethical conformity. That is, what we need is for human beings to acknowledge these rights as rights, or entitlements, or claims, and to preserve and protect them in our everyday spontaneous relationships and behavior. Not to go to be ceremonial about how to acknowledge the right and going to courts about it and so on, but simply raise our children in a way that boys respect girls equally, and we as parents respect our girls equally. In the Sudanese way, I say that when you have a situation where, I said in Sudanese Arabic and then maybe translate hopefully, يا بنت قومي غسلي العدة, meaning girl, get up and wash the dishes. You never hear boy, get up and wash the dishes. That is where discrimination against women starts. And unless you can equally say boy or girl, do this or do that, and when the boys do not see in their own life and their own, the way they are celebrated when they are born, and all sorts of things which go deep, I think, prenatal, you might say. Unless that happens, then we are not raising our children to accept the equal humanity of the other gender, the other sex, although it's a sister or a mother or and so on. So it is that is where I would like to take us to think of how to come to this point where what I call ethical conformity, that it is something that we do spontaneously, and that we do because this is the way we are, not because we expect to be acknowledged or celebrated by prizes and Nobel Peace Prizes and so on. Let me briefly, and I'm trying to stay within reasonable time limits, what I call international legality versus national juridical enforcement. I touched earlier on about, let me see what I did here. Okay. International law is neither law nor international. International law is neither law nor international. It is a code of conduct among powerful states by which they choose to comply or not to comply, which they do not respect regarding the rest of humanity. And it is done by states, for states, among states. Only states are bound by international law. All states can create principles of international law among themselves. And the practice, actually, it is a very exclusive club. It is not, in the late 19th century, Japan and the Ottoman Empire were struggling and pleading to be admitted into the company of civilized nations. And they had to comply by complying with European standards of what civilized is and what civilized nations are. And you can go and see that history. Japan was not acknowledged until the late 19th century, neither was the Ottoman Empire. And therefore, it is an exclusive club, and it's a club that has defined the field and its content before anybody else was admitted, and then it is the same club which decides who is and who is not admitted. That's how exclusive it is. And we'll see, unfortunately, the way that the international human rights system was developed is such that the pre-existing sovereign states were the only ones who were allowed to convene at meetings when the Universal Declaration was being debated, or the Genocide Convention, for example. And that it was, when the Universal Declaration was proclaimed in Paris in 1948, there were only about 50 members of the United Nations. The rest of the world was excluded. Why? Because they were not sovereign states. What happened to our sovereignty? We took it. We, I mean the pre-existing global powers. Can we have our sovereignty back? No, until we decide that we deserve it. That's how every single member of the United Nations today have been admitted to the membership of the United Nations by virtue of being acknowledged or accepted by the same, fundamentally the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Because every membership of the United Nations has to be recommended by the Security Council, and it cannot be recommended if there is any veto against the state being acknowledged as a member, and then to be voted on by the General Assembly. That's how it works. You cannot amend the Charter of the United Nations to limit, even let alone eliminate, the veto power without the consent of all 5 members who are permanent members of the Security Council. So you see, there is a fundamental structural imbalance of power and relationship in the core of the United Nations itself. You have to dismantle the United Nations in order to create an equal United Nations. And because, you see, the process, I mean, that when the Universal Declaration was being debated and adopted, there were only 4 members of the entire continent of Africa who were members of the United Nations. And those were Ethiopia, Egypt, Liberia, and South Africa. The rest of today the African Union is 54 members. So 50 members of the now 54 members were not members of the United Nations. We were not even at the table when rights were being debated and contested. So when I challenge the universality of the current system by virtue of the process by which it came to be, I mean that simply, people ask me, what do you think is missing? And I say, no, I don't know, because I was missing. And therefore, I have no idea what would have been possible. And when we talk now about collective rights, about right to development, right to peace, which the African Charter proclaimed, but never realized, the African Commission never took seriously or invested any value into those claims of the Banjul Charter. But anyway, so I can get carried away with this, but please bear with me. Therefore, I would like to emphasize this, what I call the decisive role of human agency of the subject. To me, that's crucial. Therefore, I cannot be held accountable to any human rights value that I do not acknowledge myself as a human rights value. You will tell me then, how can we do this globally? We don't have to do it globally. We do it bottom up. Everywhere, every society should struggle with these notions and transforming attitudes. When I talked about Yabidgum Ghasir al-Idda, you know, that sort of fundamental equality, unless we are doing it that way, we are not doing it at all. That's how fundamental my point is. Now, what I call people-centric practice, regardless of state sovereignty, that we should not look to the state to acknowledge or protect human rights. In fact, looking to the state already defeats the whole purpose, because it makes our agency as human beings subject to the political will of the state. And of course, the state is not an entity that acts independently. It is those who control the state. And we know what sort of control that certain powers have on a state like Sudan for the last 50 years almost. So it is a really very sort of backward looking and inhibiting and limited. By cultural transformation, I mean simply the idea that we have to transform our attitudes about, you know, type of thing. That equality for women is a fundamental human value that we acknowledge and raise our children to acknowledge, and we socialize our sort of communities into respecting and accepting. It is not something that comes after the fact. Earlier on, when I was speaking about the limitations of legal enforcement, I said it's always after the fact, meaning we have to have a violation of what we acknowledge to be a right before we can do anything about it. And even the we that I talk about here is a very vague we. Often it does not include the victims of those violations. But what I'm talking about is that we have to be forward-looking in terms of creating conditions whereby we socialize ourselves and our children. And it has to be that we socialize ourselves before we can socialize our children. Because I am a product of a culture that was very chauvinistic and very sort of anti-women equality. I was raised to think that it's normal for a boy to have his clothes washed by his sister and to have the idda washed by his sister. He wouldn't even move to offer any assistance in that regard. So my wife is here, so I have to be honest with this. So that's what I mean about cultural transformation, that it is possible, that is fundamentally essential. It is a prerequisite. If we don't have it, we don't have the right even to speak of human rights. And then I think the last point here is requirement of cultural transformation and possibilities of political mobilization. By political mobilization, I don't mean this, of course, these are very admirable practice. I mean, despite our annoyance at the inconvenience of these processions every 2-3 days of the week, but by political mobilization, I mean really raising consciousness and raising commitment and values to subscribe to these rights and entitlements in every level of, because everything is political, every relationship is political in this sense. And of course, we can get to talk about more specialized or specific types of, but I mean that the very human situation of having to enlist the support and the commitment of people to a certain course of action in order to promote that possibility. Otherwise, we have to rely on coercive enforcement, and that will have to be selective. And the selectivity will always choose the powerful over the powerless. So people who have less power have less possibility of being able to protect the rights of having them protected. So that is, I think, my concluding remarks, I think. So if I may summarize, I know, and I started by acknowledging this, I'm a heretic, and I'm really raising a challenge that goes to the core of what we all would like to believe to be human rights, and we feel good about ourselves in, oh yes, I pay my dues, I send my check to Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, but no. Let me talk a little bit about these international organizations, of which I have been part, and to whom I have been heretical ever since. The point is that there is what I call perpetuating human rights dependency in the activities of international so-called human rights advocacy organizations. And when you think about what they do, they are not really protecting human rights. They are what I call human rights journalism. It's a good thing that they tend to send delegations to situations where they document and monitor what's going on, and they write their reports, and the reports goes into international fora where people talk about and cite. Amnesty International said this, Human Rights Watch said that. But let us think about it. As I said, I used to be director of Africa Watch. Shukran wa salah. No, he's my brother, see? So it's not because it's a human value. See, my wife is here, my brother is here. What I call, I think what I'm saying is that the organizations, what I did as director of Africa Watch for 2 years, 93 to 95, is that we meet every second week or third week, quite regular meetings where we discuss where we should focus on in our next report. So we sitting in New York at the time, or for Amnesty people maybe sitting in London at the time, would decide what right to investigate, where to investigate, and how to investigate it. It's not like people sending petitions asking Amnesty to come and investigate this right or that right. It's Amnesty that decides. It's Human Rights Watch that decides. We send, I used to be part of this, a delegation of 2 or 3 researchers who parachute into the situation on the ground. FGM, of course, was a very popular sort of subject for African societies of East Africa in particular, but it could be anything that the morning meeting of Amnesty or Human Rights Watch somewhere decide that it should be investigated. And then they will gather the information that local ground NGOs have already gathered or have access to gather. Simply because they don't have the language. They don't have the cultural competence. I mean, you send a delegation of 2 or 3 young people coming from New York or London, parachuting into Congo or into Darfur, and suddenly expected to be able to gather critical information and to verify that information and to produce a credible international report on it. But because of the diligence of the young people who do this, at least for the right that Human Rights Watch chose to investigate, you can trust that the information is credible. But there is so much other information that's equally credible that never makes the reports. The reports are not written in languages of the people who are being investigated. They are not distributed to the people whose rights are being investigated. Amnesty has the practice of translating a few of its reports. Human Rights Watch does not do that. But that is the way it is. So the reports are written in London and New York to be released, to use a hook, an event, a World Bank meeting, a G7 meeting, where they address so-called donor governments to create conditions of pressure on offending governments, presumably in Africa and Asia, and Latin America to some extent, in order to protect the rights of the people of that country. But that is the way it is, the process goes. I mean, it is not that the people rise up to challenge their own governments. It is an international agency or an organization addressing an international event to create pressure which so-called donor governments choose to do or not to do. And when they create political conditionality, they choose how to frame it and how to pursue it and whether or not to really hold states or governments accountable for it. My problem with all of that, not only that it is so limited and sort of hierarchical, but that it is totally unaccountable. And it is just simply, luck of the draw, whether or not a right you care for is accepted or not accepted, to be included in a report or not. And ultimately, I say that it perpetuates and legitimizes a structural dependency. Why should Egyptian or Sudanese, not yet even, or Kenyan or other government respond positively to international pressure? Because it is dependent for security, for aid, for this and for that, and it is not accountable to its own people. So long as you create an accountability level of reporting back to the donor that, oh yes, I did this, or every 5-6 years you go to the Human Rights Council and you make your report. And so I'm saying that the whole structure is not really conducive to the protection of truly universal rights of every human being by virtue of their humanity. It is truly universal to every entitlement that human beings are entitled to by virtue of their humanity. So that is what I would like to present for your discussion this evening. Thank you very much. I think I'm a teacher, so I can do this. If you don't mind, Madam Chair, is that okay? Okay. Simply, I think. Yes. Because there is a recording, I think.
See the role of international organizations in sort of like the role of the universal and the local and how they can play against each other on a practical level, because as you mentioned in the case of the Ottoman Empire in Japan, like the universal order was used as a sort of litmus test to exclude people from the idea of what was modern. So I'm wondering if you could say more of practically how the structures that we exist in today could exist along local ideas of human rights. Yeah.
I think we have a deadlock here now because of the history that we have an established system that claims to be an international human rights system that claims to be universal. We know that it was not universal in its conception. We know that it has not been universal in its practice. And we know that the lack of universality is not just simply a moral judgment we pass, it's a structural, political, hardcore reality. Now it's very popular these days to condemn Russia for the invasion of the Ukraine. Rightly so. And the atrocities that are being committed, the humanitarian crisis that is occurring in that country. But everything that Russia is doing in the Ukraine, the United States did in Iraq. Not a single word has been said about the fundamental violation of sovereignty, because the point is that the Charter of the United Nations prohibits violation of sovereignty. The United States violated the sovereignty of Iraq for absolutely no legitimate reason whatsoever. 9 months after the United States invaded Iraq and seized the sovereignty of Iraq, the Secretary of the United States, Secretary of the United States, sent a letter to the government that the United States appointed in Iraq, telling them that we had your sovereignty, here you can have it back. That's exactly what happened. What accountability did the United States and Britain face for the illegal and fundamentally atrocious invasion of the sovereignty of Iraq and so on? So that's why, because I'm saying that the point is that it is structural, so that it is, you don't even know where to start. And therefore we should not, when you say the universal, it is a question of privilege of the powerful to decide whom to acknowledge or to bring to the table or not to bring to the table, to what extent. Because even when Japan and the Ottoman Empire were admitted, I cite them for having petitioned, not that their petition were acknowledged equally. And even the very relationship whereby their petition is submitted and then acknowledged or not acknowledged already confirms the pre-existing order by which European powers were the masters of the field and so on. And it is not what you mentioned about modernity and enlightenment and so on. As I said earlier on at the beginning, I said that colonization is often legitimized in the name of modernity, religion, modernity, civilizing mission that the European colonial powers use to legitimize among themselves the way they carved up Africa to be colonized by each power. So what I'm saying is that it goes back deep, and it's not going to change by itself. Therefore, we have to refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of the system, at least as a beginning to think about what to do next or how to do it otherwise. I don't know if I responded to your point. Yes? Yes?
What can or should we do when we observe this kind of anti-women rights behavior, especially when it's so ingrained in our culture here in Sudan, for instance?
Start by ourselves. You know, every change starts with a single person. So every person is in fact in a position to start change about this type of behavior or attitude and so on. By the way you just conduct yourself, how you address your female or male co-student or co-worker, how you raise your children, how hopefully inshallah when you have children, he's too young now to maybe
soon, inshallah.
Inshallah, yes. So but what I'm saying is that I know it's a long way to go, but that's how it happens. What I think is problematic is to self-congratulatory attitude about, oh yes, we have international organizations that protect human rights. We don't, and they don't. You know, I tried to think when I was trying to write this book, I tried to think of examples of a single human right that has actually been protected by the United Nations. I couldn't think of any. Because it is what you would see is it is a series of diplomatic maneuvers and sort of declarations and conferences and this and that. But in the final analysis, what happens on the ground to a single person that was a violation of that person's rights that has been corrected by the United Nations, I couldn't think of any. Therefore, I think the acknowledgement that we don't have the protection that we claim we have, that we have to think radically differently about what it is that we want to protect and how to protect it, and then to go about it ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves. What I call radical self-determination. And of course, again, in the nature of power, that the powerless tend to negotiate with the powerful to get a fraction of that power. So women organizations protest, that young people protest, and so on. But I think all of that is good. Let's go as far as it can. But I don't think it will go all the way. And I think that if each of us will confront ourselves every day by the limitations of our claims about protection or respect for human rights, we can start to change. So in a way, and it is where we are. So if I'm here, then I can't move from here to here unless I move from here to here. Meaning that change has to happen within the person for the person to act spontaneously and consistently in that way. It's a long way to go, but it's the only way to go, I claim.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I arrived late, but thank you so much for being so frank. I think that neo-colonialism is in the heads of, let's say, both sides. To make it simple, both sides. The neo-colonialist and the neo-colonized. So with the due respect, if there are some associations here working for human rights, I wonder if this neo-colonialist attitude is conscious. I mean, there is consciousness, awareness. And that in this case, if there is no awareness, if there is a kind of a schizophrenic attitude of the people working to claim or to protect, let's say, as you say, human rights. So you said, if we don't change ourselves, we can never claim that we are changing the world. So are the same people that are fighting for the protection of human rights educating the children to act spontaneously, or they just do this as a job because this is how the world is going, because this is where the money is, and then at 5 o'clock, like people working at the ministry, I mean, there is consciousness about this, there is awareness, the people feels this, or this neo-colonialism or whatever, it's so embedded now in our mind that no one sees it anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I would suggest that even we don't even acknowledge what we just said. That people, so-called advocates of human rights, are not aware of the fact that they are not really advocates. That they are not really holding themselves accountable to the same values that they claim that they are promoting in their societies and communities. In 2002 or 3, I published an article about Arab human rights organizations. I think it is something called, you'll find it in Human Rights Quarterly. In 2002, I think, it's about human rights in the Arab region, or human rights organizations in the Arab region, or something to that effect, in which I reported studies which shows that the most massive anti-women equality and undemocratic practice that was going on inside human rights organizations in the region. We had the phenomenon of President for Life, the Arab Human Rights Organization, the Egyptian Human Rights Organization, all these regional and national human rights organizations reflected the same values and practices that the state, which they claim to be contesting and challenging, have been practicing. I think that it's a question of acknowledging the limitations of what we do, and that we are not really that much different from the people we seek to hold accountable to those human rights violations. And then really it is a question of soul searching and challenging ourselves about what we do and how we do it and so on. On the colonial and neo-colonial, actually, I think the colonial and the post-colonial are codependent or interdependent. So the post-colonial is defined by the colonial. And I tried to coin a term, I call it past-colonial, meaning that I don't really have to, I don't want to define myself or my self-awareness and struggle in anti-colonial terms. Colonialism has been part of our history, but it does not have to be and cannot be part of our future. So it is not simply that some are colonial, some are neo-colonial, some are post-colonial. All of that is still trapped in that bubble of colonialism as a European phenomenon. And you did say that, and I'm sorry that you missed the opening remark I was making about really the massive scale of exploitation and domination that we have in every walk of our lives at every level of our communities and our relationships. And all of that is really colonialism. So colonialism is not only European. Europe has been spectacular in one thing, that colonialism, which has always been, which is imperialism really, which has always been with human societies from ancient times, but and here the question of decolonizing is why keep calling it colonize and not imperial or imperialism and so on, is because I think it is a question of displacement. That European consciousness, European epistemology, European values, European practices. I'm a lawyer. I studied law, including Sharia law, but also primarily English common law at the University of Khartoum in the 60s. I went to Britain to train more into English, and then went to Scotland to do my PhD in Scotland, and came back to teach the same thing and I felt very good about it. I thought I was doing the right thing. In fact, I think that our whole generation of post-colonial lawyers have failed in our fundamental charge of transforming our legal system into something Sudanese. Still, we don't know what Sudanese means, but we always talk about Sudanese this, Sudanese that. I think I'm talking about really, that's why it is a fundamental challenge to all of us to think about what is it about, what I meant to say about the European colonialism is that it succeeded in perpetuating itself in the colonized. That they projected a mirror image of themselves into the other, so that to be civilized you have to be European. And by the way, of course, you can never be European, because after all, you are not European. But therefore, when you try and you fail, what do you expect? When you don't try, what do you expect? You can't win. And therefore, I just give it up completely and look for other ways. Unfortunately, it is not that easy, because the Europeans took 400, 500 years killing themselves before they turned to killing other people. So it is not going to be easy, and we're still doing it among ourselves too. We are being a European in that sense, but that is how we build a consciousness that tries to transcend. The European Human Rights Convention is the most successful. It's more successful than the UN system, but ultimately it is European. It is not universal. And you have to be a member of and when you see the negotiations that goes on before you are admitted into the EU or admitted into the European Human Rights Council and so on, you realize that it's a very exclusive club. And not everybody gets to be admitted and all be kept or allowed to stay. Which is fine, let the Europeans do the European thing. But but not assume that everybody else has to do it before everybody else is civilized enough to be acknowledged as a human being. Sorry? Yes, please. I'll come back next.
So you mentioned that you think that
Alaikum salam.
you mentioned that you think Sharia law is incompatible with human law, at least right now. So how do you think that as Islamic societies and nations we can adapt Sharia law to be more, or do you think it needs to be adapted even?
Not necessarily adapted, but changed. Because adapting implies a degree of softer compatibility and so on. What I think is that we have to challenge the fundamental premise of the formation of Sharia. I don't know how many of us are lawyers or studied Sharia law at any point, but what we now call Sharia, in fact, the term is not in the Quran in the way that we use it today. It is not a normative legal system that defines what an Islamic way of life that the Quran describes. And you will find that there are many uses of the term Sharia that are incompatible with the way that we understand it today. Second is that the term Sharia actually was not used among Muslim theologians, so-called al-mutakallimun, for the first 200-300 years of Islamic history. So it's a late development, the term itself. And it was never really used by those founding scholars in the way that we use it today. Actually, I think that the discourse of Sharia and Islamic states and so on is a post-colonial, going back to the post-colonial, is a post-colonial phenomenon. Meaning that it is people like Muhammad Qutb, yes, but even before that in the 1930s, people like Muhammad Asad was, by the way, was an Austrian convert to Islam who came with very romantic notions about what it is to be Muslim and how to make it and to transform the Muslim world single-handedly. So he became an advisor to King Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia in the 1920s. And eventually he gave up on that, went to Pakistan and became part of that movement. And they were the people who raised the possibility of a so-called territorial state, what I call territorial, which is not simply a nation, because Pakistan is not a nation, but it is a territorial state. But the idea, of course, is it Pakistan as a state for Muslims or an Islamic state? That's a debate that has never been settled in Pakistan itself, even as we speak. But people like Muhammad Asad, who wrote Islamic Principles of Governance, I think that was a major book that contributed to the idea that there is something called Islamic system of government that we can do, and all we need to do is just simply create some laws that we call Sharia and enforce them through the state legal system that we have from the colonial time. And the contradictions continue in that system. But I think that is the beginning. So it is something of the 1920s and 30s. Not that it has been, there has never been a codification of Sharia in Muslim history. And it's impossible to codify. Why? Because there is such diversity of opinion that you can never tell what is and what is not Sharia, except as a matter of personal conviction. Yeah, I believe that let's not talk about the prayer, do this or do the other, but talk about normative system, the family law, inheritance, so-called hudud. I say so-called hudud because there is no term, the term hudud is not in the Quran describing those crimes that we now call hudud crimes. Where did that come from? It came from fiqh, from jurisprudence, not from the Quran or hadith. Now we take it so much for granted that a'udhu billah, we can't challenge hudud. Actually, they are not hudud. The Quran does not call them hudud, and they came about, they were not defined. Take any of the so-called hudud. It is not defined in the Quran. The Quran says, السارق والسارقة فاقطعوا أيديهم, meaning a thief, be it a man or a woman, have their hand cut off. It doesn't define what sariqa is, what theft is. There is a definition that came from fiqh, from Islamic jurisprudence, which may have made sense for Muslims at that time, but it no longer makes sense. And I will mention the most outrageous, sorry about that, maybe someone is telling me something, that you find the most outrageous example is the definition of theft, sariqa. It has to be something. Now, this is what Muslim scholars define sariqa to mean, because it is not in the Quran, it is not in Hadith. They said it has to be taking by stealth, so that if you confront someone on the street, so-called, تسعة طويلة ولا طويلة تسعة, if you confront someone and force them to give you something that is not theft, it has to be taken by stealth, they say. For a minimum amount, al-nisab, out of a hirs, meaning a locked place, without a doubt, meaning without shubha. So these four elements are what defines the had of so-called sariqa. If any of them is missing, the crime is not sariqa haddiyah. Therefore, you cannot cut the hand off. Okay. They also decided collectively among themselves, consensus-wise, that theft of public property is not sariqa haddiyah, because you have a doubt of being entitled to some of that. So if you steal $1 million or $100 million from the Sudan bank, you just go downtown and force the bank staff to open up and take the money, and you are an official, but it is public property, you can't be convicted of the crime of theft, according to the had definition of theft. So there are fundamental problems with the idea that we have something called hudud, which we have to enforce because God said so. Now, yes, the fact that I'm here talking to you like this, maybe until my bottle of water filled up, it shows that there's a chance that someone can say this. I hope by saying it, I open minds to the notion that we really have to challenge this notion that there's some so-called an Islamic state, which has never been in history, that's capable of enforcing Sharia, which is a contradiction in terms, and again, which has never happened historically, and so that we force ourselves to live a miserable life like we do these days, because we are trying to live up to something that really is not really vital for our true identity as Muslims. So it is possible to challenge all this. And if you like, I can give you sources that I have argued this, and I published on it, and you can see what I'm saying on this. And I would stand by this position. That's why actually I stood by this position 40 years away from the country. I'm hoping to be able to stand by it coming into the country.
Thank you very much.
I think, yes, sorry, I tend to carry on. Please.
Thank you very much. It's been extremely interesting, and of course it brought me back many years when we met the first time. You said, of course, a lot of things that's very interesting, and I want to pick up on two of them. One, you said that Sudanese are still trying to find out what it is to be Sudanese. I remember, a long time ago, I read a book by Yusuf al-Hassan, Becoming Sudanese, and I think he's just giving many examples of it, the process of it. But to take it up to the present, in your view, you had a revolution here around the three ideas of freedom, peace, and justice. Was that a good effort to define the Sudanese, to find the Sudanese identity, or was it as good as any other effort, that we've seen in history? Then that's one question. Then I want to maybe have a little bit more difficult question for you, because I think when you're talking about the UN, and you're quite cutting, because you're saying that the UN has never defended or achieved human rights. Now, so the question is very specific to you. Can you, work and, as I say, be quite successful in defending human rights without actually reaching the full objective or whatever right there is, right to life? We are trying to prevent wars. We cannot stop all wars, but we can stop many wars, and we can stop many deaths. Now, isn't that also protecting human rights? Thank you.
Doing good is not protecting human rights. That is, I started with the definition of human rights are the entitlement of a human being by virtue of being human. That goes all the way to very elementary and fundamental ideas of human dignity and respect for human dignity and the moral worth of the human being. But you talk about wars. I don't know if the United Nations has ever stopped or prevented a war. What we do is that we manage wars, or we limit it sort of, it is a whole structure of peacekeeping, and it's not even what they call 6.5, I mean the idea of peacekeeping. Peacekeeping requires the consent of the state where the conflict is going on for the peacekeepers to come into the country in the first place. When we had massive killing of people in Darfur in 2003, the UN could not impose its will to come to stop the killing of Sudanese by Sudanese government. It had to get the consent, and this is true of every situation. And it cannot be other. You cannot force yourself into a situation. Who are you to force yourself into a situation? It has to be approved by the Security Council. It has to be acknowledged as Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. That is, Chapter 7 can only be triggered by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Because you have to have a determination that there is a threat to international peace and security. Not a threat to human rights. A threat to international peace and security that justifies for the Security Council to debate and to decide whether that is true, and if so, to start sort of a process of gradual, like sanctions and certain types of measures, ultimately to sanction military intervention. Where does that happen? How did it happen? Who decides? Which situation? Darfur did not warrant an international intervention to protect international peace and security. But we know what massive level of human rights and human dignity that was going on there. So I don't know. Of course, there is so much to say here. But let me say that I think simply there is no time. I mean, we can't wait for things to change on their own. They don't. Whatever change happened in human history was done by people. And we just have to inspire ourselves into thinking differently about what we are doing and how to do it well. So, about being Sudanese, I wish Yusuf Fadl's work was popularized and integrated into our curriculum and into our educational system, but it remained a classic scholarship work that remains on. Actually, there is a very powerful book that written, I think, by a Norwegian scholar about the ethics of Ya'aliyin, I think, or about of people. I'm a Ja'ali, so I can celebrate that. Okay, yes. So, but I'm saying that there is so much to Sudan than Ja'ali or than Nubi or than this and that. Meaning, the three, Hurriya, Salam, Adalas, this is human, but not exclusively Sudanese. It is every human being can claim credit for this and commitment to this. But I'm saying about when we say something about Sudanese law, it has to be the Sudanese state. What makes it a state and what makes it Sudanese? The minimum is that it has to be equally Sudanese for all people of the country of Sudan, not of some people of Central and regional Sudan for the rest of the people of Sudan. And this is the essence of our problem now, that we are being going in circles, and our country and our towns are disintegrating into chaotic situations because we are not willing to confront the reality that we are not really equal citizens of our own country. We are not. And we don't acknowledge that we have a problem with this. Because we tend to think of whoever we are, that we are Sudanese par excellence, but everybody else is sort of marginal to their Sudanese-ness. I think I have one on this point, and then maybe, do you mind, Ali, I think our friend here, no please, because you had your hand up earlier. So I'll come over here. So, overlapping consensus. That they can be, and they can be through overlapping consensus. That it is not by proclaiming ahead of time that these are human rights, but working consensus building from the bottom up, and the values that we agree about among human society, so that you can retrospectively discover universality to have been achieved through consistent practice according to certain values. You will know it when you get it. Because when you say you decide, who is the you who is deciding? As soon as you get into that, then you are no longer talking about consensus. You are talking about power relations and imposition by the powerful over the powerless. But if you are letting people practice, and without even my phrase, see, even my language, letting people practice. Who am I to say letting people practice? But if you want to study, I think going to the scholar, the Swedish scholar turned out that who mustn't discover certain values as Sudanese values, it is coming to study it anthropologically as a matter of what is the human practice of this. That will be the consensus of communities. It is usually that something, but because you are not using it as a power tool, you are genuinely seeking to understand what it is to be human and how is that evolving over time. That's why it's so helpful, I think. Yes, I think Ali and then the young man on the other side.
Thank you, Abdullahi, for this very sumptuous intellectual meal and for us tonight, as ever, as always. You know better that the idea of human rights started from Western thought at the beginning, that developed by natural law at one time, but later on you have the social contract theories, notably Locke, who developed the idea of human rights and had it as three basic rights initially, with life, liberty, and the protection of property. But the concept then developed until when we got to the United Nations, 1946, 48, when it was finally adopted, 1948, there were two camps, even within Western societies. The European Western countries were for what you might call civil and political rights. Marxist European countries, so socialists, espoused the idea of economic and social rights. Eventually, you had the United Nations Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, That's December 1948, which took some time before it can evolve into a part of the legal system, the law of nations, by adopting two covenants, one on civil and political rights and one on social and economic rights, so that it can get enough support for each of those. Eventually, they became ratified in 1976, so it took 20 years after, almost after 1948. And later on came, after the independence of Africa, for example, African countries, the first to adopt another covenant after that, or convention on human rights, were the Europeans, Western Europeans. The European Convention was one of the first. And later on you had Inter-American, then you had African Charter 1981, that was ratified later than that, and thus it was ratified in 86, which included another notion about not just individual rights, but people's rights. And they talked about the right to development as a right to the people. And if you look at human rights, you find that development is very essential for, not just for the protection, but for the promotion of the idea of human rights. If you do not have enough development in a country, you will not find this general recognition and acceptance of human rights of all who try to seek to abide by it and to try to seek to protect it and to bring actions in the course to enforce it when there is enough development in the country. So development is very important. Development is very important, even to, it was to try to combat colonialism or imperialism in the past. If the country is not developed enough, and there have been even a tendency, even until the 1990s, I was in the States, and there was a special issue of Sunday Times, I think, magazine, that the person writing the article was arguing that perhaps African countries should be put under the mandate of other countries. Not necessarily return to colonialism, but perhaps he said even that the Asian tigers could be involved so that they can help these countries to develop, so that they can help the people in those countries. And in fact, there was the front page, there was a hand descending from heaven like that, trying to save all these drowning African countries, to lift them from their lack of development and lack of sovereignty. So human rights is important in that respect, and its universality is also, to my mind, important. Seeing that it's not just cultural elitism that we should abide by, but we should look at the universal as an ideal for which all we should aspire for and seek to implement it in our society. Even in Western societies, as you know, they are not uniform. Even in the States, which is, and sometimes they do not follow new international conventions and treaties, thinking that their legal system is better evolved than what the international community is to try to do. And therefore, there are many things you know better than I that America did not ratify, and they're still going without. Thank you.
Well, Ali, okay, all that is fine as far as it goes, but and then what? How far does it take us to really truly mean what we say when we say universal declaration of human rights? The fact that only 4 members of Africa, of the entire continent of Africa, were members of the United Nations at the time was because the rest of Africa was colonized by the same European so-called superior civilized powers which colonized Africa since the turn of the century. The Universal Declaration was declared in Paris. Paris and France continued to colonize Algeria and conduct a vicious war of anti-liberation and anti-independence war in which the French authorities perpetrated every atrocity that the German Nazi perpetrated in France. And it was not until 1962 that Algeria was independent from France where the Universal Declaration was declared. So I don't look for European experience to tell me what human rights are about. And European experience has been European experience like everybody else. Imperial, authoritative, authoritarian, vicious. 50 million Europeans were killed by other Europeans in the Second World War. 25 million Russians were killed by the Soviet Union in Russia, more than the Nazis ever did. So there are sufficient evidence, I think, that Europe is not really a model to anybody, for anybody. They are just simply being human like everybody else. Power mongering, vicious, ambitious, all of that like every other human being. The idea of universality is new even to the Europeans. Because when you talk about the Enlightenment and about European modernity and this and that, it was not intended for non-Europeans. I was not part of Kant's thinking about what sort of globalism or universality is about. It never occurred to him that I would qualify in whatever it is that he was dreaming of. Fine, that is nothing exceptional about it, but we shouldn't acknowledge and give more credit than what is due. In any case, we need to go further. We know that we are not going far enough, or are not going fast enough to really protect the human dignity of human beings everywhere, and we need to act sooner. And we need to act in ways that are sustainable, not simply sort of rhetorical. Yes, please.
Well,
and I promise, I think we should, maybe.
All right, I first want to thank you very much for the very stimulating and intriguing lecture and ensuing discussion on the very essence of being human. You mentioned something to do with radical self-determination, and just pricked my imagination there a little bit on how do I go about that as an individual. I mean, you may not have specific answers for me, but in your view, I would go that on an individual level, and even with nations that are still dependent, very dependent on the powers that be.
I think the very idea that it is, as soon as you mention nations, you are not talking about what I'm talking about. By radical self-determination, I mean the right of every single person to be that single person constantly and permanently. It is not a right that is extinguished by being used once and during independence from the colonial power. So self-determination is not something that Sudan achieved in '56. It is something that Sudan has not achieved in '56, have not achieved now, and will not achieve in the future unless every single Sudanese take the right as a claim personally. And of course, you are not going to simply declare yourself independent politically and run around concluding treaties with other countries. But
that was my worry.
No, but think about what it takes to be autonomous, what it takes to be independent as a person. And you will not achieve it all at once, and you will not achieve it all the time, probably, but that is the way it is. If I talk about what I'm talking about in terms of radical self-determination, this is what I mean. It's a right that is never extinguished. It's a right that is never collectively exercised. It's a right or a claim, entitlement, let's call it, where every single person can do it for herself every day, every morning. And not simply we exercise it once and then put it on the shelf or lock it up in a safe somewhere. So in that sense, I think, remember, I think it was, start with yourself and start, let me say, put it this way. I start with myself. By what I say, what I do every day. And being accountable for it, being transparent about it. And that is how it goes. I know it sounds sort of dream-like, but that is what the nature of human experience is. I mean, everything that we have now was a dream somewhere, sometime. Thank you very much.
Wish we could have you more, yes.
We can carry on. Self-determination. Thank you very much. I think if you can carry on, because he had his hand up.
Yeah,
But
I mean, yes, go outside.
we can chat about that.